A lot of you might not know this, but when I first started this channel, I was still in my junior year of college, and one of the classes I was enrolled in was marine biology. Unsurprisingly, I really enjoyed the class and even ended up turning a few of its lectures into videos, like this one in February when the class had just begun, then this one a few months later, and finally one right as the semester was wrapping up in June. Averaging more than 1 million views each, I think it's safe to say you all, my audience, enjoyed marine biology as much as I did. But I'll also admit that by the end of the class, I couldn't help but feel like something in my understanding was missing. While I had a blast learning about things like ocean currents, intertidal zones, and the different kinds of plankton, there didn't seem to be any sort of unifying model of ocean life the same way there was for life on land. You see, by this point in my college career, I had already taken another class called Biogeography. So I had already been exposed to Alfred Russel Wallace's method of breaking the world into a number of distinct units or realms based on the kinds of plants and animals that lived there. With one map, the history of all terrestrial life could clearly be illustrated, and I wanted the same thing for the ocean, to somehow holistically organize the other half of life on Earth. I guess what I really wanted wasn't marine biology, but rather marine biogeography. While this was unfortunately not included in the course, a quick look online will show you why. There is no widely accepted model. It would appear the oceans are simply too vast, too rich with life, and have too complicated of a history for us to be able to claim, even in this day and age, to fully understand it. Though this hasn't stopped people from trying. If you'll remember, my obsession with biogeography really started with this video on dodos, where understanding the circumstances around its evolution is what gave us all a newfound appreciation for these amazing animals. It turns out biogeography is a really effective way of communicating to people why certain environments are so special, and by extension, why they deserve protection. That's probably why in 2007, the World Wildlife Foundation assembled an international cast of scientists to collaborate on an all-encompassing classification system. They called it MEOW, or Marine Ecoregions of the World, a bioregionalization of coastal and shelf areas. Conveniently, they also provided us with a map, and so today I want to take a deep dive into these divisions and see the ways ocean environments both differ and are similar to terrestrial ones. And who knows, maybe end up making something future marine biogeography lectures can show on their first day of class. Okay, so the ocean is a pretty big place. You all know this. It covers 71% of the Earth's surface, more than twice the land area. That's why by the 1870s, when Wallace first made his map, the open ocean was still very much a mystery. While the shapes of the continents are all near perfect, the ocean floor was reduced to some vague contour lines, showing they had little to no knowledge of features like mid-ocean ridges. While I have no doubt Wallace knew the ocean was an equally, if not more complex system than that on land, without inventions like submarines or techniques like echo sounding, he simply had no way of figuring it out for himself, leaving both his and by extension all future study of biogeography limited to land. It wouldn't be until the 1950s that sounding would allow us to produce maps like this, revealing many features such as seamounts, trenches, atolls, mid-ocean ridges, and continental shelves that we'd been totally unaware of prior to this. It was only once we finally had a firm understanding of marine geography, or what's sometimes called oceanography, that we could start building upon this with a biological component. So it only makes sense that if we want to understand marine biogeography, first we need a lesson in marine geography. Looking back to this map, we can see the oceans can be divided into two distinct levels based on elevation. For the most part, the ocean floor is a deep, dark place, falling beneath 5 kilometers of water, placing 90% of it within what's called the abyssal plain. While life certainly persists here in the abyss, without sunlight, all life is limited to what organic matter drifts down from above, leaving this as by far the Earth's largest and emptiest ecosystem. As you should all know, oceans are deserts. That is, of course, except for where the sea floor rises to meet the sunlight, entering what's called the photic zone. Here, photosynthesizers can work their magic and serve as the foundation of a much more productive environment. Ironically, this ends up forcing ocean life to conform to wherever water is supported by continental shelves, explaining why our map of marine realms shows them all clinging to the coastline. And from a biogeographic perspective, this makes things really interesting, as this basically creates one long chain of ecosystems. Why this matters is because in my Biogeography 101 class, I also learned a term, ring species, which is where members of the same population become divided by some geographical obstacle, evolve apart only to come back together as two completely different species. And that's basically what the entire ocean is, one unending loop where everything everywhere is related but all evolving in their own directions based on the local conditions. The implications of this really bizarre geography are that unlike land where continents can become isolated, there is no geographic separation between ocean ecosystems. In my mind, this means there should really only be one oceanic realm, but well, this map shows 12 of them, so clearly there's something I'm missing. Perhaps the most understandable of these realms is the Arctic Ocean, as here America and Eurasia enclose the body of water. But let this serve as our first lesson in how ocean environments react differently to extreme conditions compared to terrestrial ones. Here on land, the Arctic is a mostly barren place where water turns to ice, freezing the ground and making virtually all forms of life impossible. But thanks to the salts present in the ocean, water remains, well, water here, even if it falls below freezing, and wherever there's liquid water, life can persist. However, even if the ocean water itself doesn't freeze, there is still tons of sea ice here, thanks to the glaciers of surrounding lands. Inevitably, sea ice scrapes against every rocky surface, removing any and all plants, animals, and even algae that might otherwise grow here. This means that despite being the shallowest of all the oceans, no large photosynthetic organisms can actually grow on the shelf here. Again, if we were talking about land, this would be the end of the discussion, as without photosynthesizers like plants, you can't have any more complex of an ecosystem. But that's not exactly how ocean life works. That's because here there's also something called phytoplankton, microscopic organisms that float in the water column, soaking in the sun to produce energy, very similar to plants, but tiny. Then equally tiny creatures called the zooplankton eat the phytoplankton like an animal would, and together these plankton form the foundation that virtually everything else in the ocean relies on. Specifically grazing animals like cetaceans, cephalopods, chondrichthyes, and of course lots and lots of fish, which in turn support predatory animals like cetaceans, cephalopods, chondrichthyes, and of course fish, altogether forming the standard model of ocean life pretty much everywhere. Though besides its extreme climate, the Arctic also has an extreme geography, literally being at the top of the world for nearly half the year. The sun sets beneath the horizon, not to rise again for several months. Without sunlight, phytoplankton can't photosynthesize, and the entire Arctic Ocean food web breaks down. Again, on land, this would spell the end of the ecosystem, but in the ocean, all this means is that every year, countless sea creatures migrate south to where the sun still shines. Eventually, they'll enter the temperate latitudes, where ice is no longer an issue and sedentary photosynthesizers can finally establish themselves. In these cold, nutrient-rich waters, a type of algae called kelp has filled this role by attaching themselves to the ground with a holdfast, which are not roots, remember that, it'll come out later, and then using air sacs called pneumatocysts to buoy themselves up the entire water column. When they grow together, kelp form a forest-like environment, providing animals with all sorts of niches not available in Arctic waters. As such, these kelp forests have become incredibly rich habitats, as productive as any rainforest. In ecological terms, the presence of kelp also broadens the productive base of the entire ecosystem, where now plankton and kelp both support a larger population of grazers and in turn more predators. Though, like we just saw, many of the animals that feed in these kelp forests are actually the same exact ones that feed in Arctic waters. This means that really no matter where you go in the ocean, you're going to find more or less the same assortment of animals. And because of that, the only way to really distinguish between different marine environments is to look at their primary producers. Again, this is different than life on land, right? Here, all primary production is done by plants, which feed animals unique to their location. This is why typically when making biogeography videos, I often end up focusing more on animals, as they tend to be the most telling members of their environments. But it would appear that's not true for the ocean. That's why on our map, we'll see the temperate waters become their own realms. In the Pacific, this creates one continuous stretch of kelp-dominated shelf from the top of Taiwan across the Bering Strait all the way down to Baja California, the temperate North Pacific realm. In the Atlantic, things are a little more complicated. Here, the shelf splits into an American and a European side, leaving two separate coastlines in the same climate. My initial reaction was to assume this would create two distinct realms, but we have to remember this is the ocean we're talking about. So even though these two coasts are thousands of miles apart, they are still connected by continental shelf and the open ocean, which means there aren't really any notable differences between these two communities, resulting in a unified temperate North Atlantic realm. However, any further south and we'll cross over the Tropic of Cancer, indicating things are starting to warm up. With good growing conditions year-round, access to sunlight no longer acts as a limiting factor here, allowing plankton to grow and reproduce until there are no more nutrients in the water to sustain them. We can see evidence for this in just how clear the ocean water is here, indicating there's drastically fewer microscopic organisms floating around in it. In fact, tropical waters are so nutrient poor that kelp can't grow here. You see, if you'll remember a moment ago, I told you kelp clings to the ocean floor using a holdfast. Its only purpose is to cling to whatever rocky surface it was lucky enough to attach itself to, and not to gather nutrients like the roots of a plant would. Without dedicated structures for collecting nutrients, kelp obtain all their nutrition by absorbing dissolved nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, or whatever else they need directly into their bodies. The simplicity of this tactic is both what has allowed kelp to take over wherever nutrients are plentiful, but also what's preventing them from moving into the tropics, leaving this niche open for something else that can more actively gather nutrients. This is where corals come in. As you should all know by now, corals aren't plants or even algae, but rather animals, just like us. While at first it might seem a little strange for an animal to serve as the primary producer for an environment, when you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense. You see, actively gathering nutrients is just a fancy way of saying eating, which corals do by sticking out their little arms, waiting for something to float by, grabbing it and bringing it into their mouth. This gains corals access to far more nutrients than kelp, allowing them to persist even in the poor tropical waters. Of course, with nearly all of its time dedicated to nutrient collection, this leaves very little left for corals to actually produce energy of their own. That's why they struck up a symbiotic relationship with another algae called zooxanthellae, which live inside special pouches in the bodies of the corals where they're safe to photosynthesize, providing corals with up to 90% of their energy needs in exchange for nutrients they otherwise wouldn't be able to collect on their own. All in all, the ability for coral to both eat and photosynthesize is what gives them the competitive edge over kelp and allows them to form the foundation of tropical ocean ecosystems. That's why here we'll see the temperate Atlantic realm becomes the tropical Atlantic realm, clinging to both the American and African coasts. Though a quick look back to this map will show us that this portion of the African shelf is exceedingly narrow, meaning few reefs are to be found here. Luckily, the same isn't true for the American side of things, where volcanism and sedimentary deposits have built up a huge area of shallow water we now know as the Caribbean. These underwater platforms in turn support the Andros Reef in the Bahamas, the Florida Reef here in the US, and the greatest reef on this side of the world, the Mesoamerican Reef off the coast of Belize. Plus, countless smaller reefs scattered throughout the sea. However, if we keep looking south, before long we'll cross over the Tropic of Capricorn, bringing us back into the temperate latitudes. Here, upwelling stirs up nutrients from the depths, again creating conditions that are favorable to kelp. But unlike the North Atlantic, here the continental shelves diverge, meaning we get two separate realms, temperate South America and temperate Africa. Following the American side of this upwelling zone brings us all the way up to Peru before waters warm up again. Where this happens, you guessed it, nutrients become scarce and corals take over, establishing the small tropical East Pacific realm. Something I find interesting about this realm is that while today it may be completely separate from the Caribbean, as recently as 3 million years ago this wasn't the case, and species would have been free to swim between the Atlantic and the Pacific. But ever since Panama rose from the ocean, all mixing has ceased, allowing this small stretch of coastline to develop its very own distinct character, one that's now more closely related to the rest of the Pacific than the Atlantic, despite being only a few miles away from it. Beyond this is the temperate North Pacific, which we already talked about, so now let's look around the temperate African coast. Here, similar to South America, the coastline quickly runs back north, but this time it spends much more time in the tropics, opening up basically the entire Indian Ocean to corals, creating what's referred to as the West Indo-Pacific realm. Besides the coast, there are also a number of island groups like the Mascarene and Maldives that sit atop substantial volcanic plateaus, creating the perfect environments for reefs far deeper into the ocean. However, when I took a closer look at what kinds of primary producers actually live here, I found something strange. You see, while the Great Chagos Bank stands as the single largest coral atoll in the world, not too far away on the Saya de Malha Bank, coral only covers about 10% of its surface, with the rest being covered in seagrass. Now, seagrass is interesting because unlike kelp, which is an algae, seagrass is, well, grass, which is a plant. And actually, seagrass is the only plant that's evolved to live fully in the ocean. But what doesn't make sense is why they randomly seem to have outcompeted corals here. At first, I thought maybe it could be because the Mascarene Plateau stands in the way of westward moving currents, making this area a small upwelling zone, rich in nutrients despite its tropical location. But if that were the case, then wouldn't it just be kelp that dominated here? So then I thought, well, maybe there's some kind of predatory animal here that eats corals but not seagrass. But then I remembered this is the ocean we're talking about, so any animals here would also be everywhere else. So then I thought, heck, maybe humans are behind this. They could have destroyed coral reefs that were once here and only seagrass grew back in its place. After all, that's what happens here on land when you cut down a forest. But, well, this bank is deep in the ocean, far from any industrial fisheries, and in fact, this is one of the least understood marine ecosystems anywhere in the world because of just how remote it is. So I don't think this really makes sense either. But finally, after much thought, I think I finally figured it out, but only because of another video I made. You see, recently I looked at some of the Earth's most notable lost islands, and I actually mentioned the Saya de Malha Bank because just a few thousand years ago, sea levels were low enough to expose most of this plateau. When this Saya Island stood as dry land, it would have hosted all kinds of plants and animals, and gradually would have built up a layer of soil atop the volcanic rock. But then as the Ice Age came to a close, sea levels rose by about 60 meters, causing the whole island to fall back beneath the waves, taking this topsoil with it. And I think this is the key, because as we learned earlier, kelp need large rocks to attach their holdfast to, and corals will only grow on top of other rocky surfaces. So what this layer of sand and soil does is make it impossible for both coral and kelps to establish themselves here. But as a plant with roots and all, seagrasses are literally the only thing in the ocean actually meant to grow in soil, explaining why they dominate this bank. This also explains why the distribution of seagrasses doesn't appear to follow the same temperate tropical divide, as they have a store of nutrients all their own, so they'll grow wherever kelps and corals can't, or at least that's my thinking on the matter. The reason I was so determined to figure this out is because our entire model of marine biogeography depends on what photosynthesizers grow where, and so seagrass meadows could potentially form their own kinds of ecoregions. But because they don't actually compete with other photosynthesizers and simply occupy a different niche within the greater coral and kelp kingdoms, they don't qualify as their own separate realms. Following the rest of the Asian continental coastline, we'll finally arrive at what I consider to be the crown jewel of ocean life on Earth, Nusantara, or the Central Indo-Pacific. If you watched my geography of the Ice Age video a while back, you should remember that just a few thousand years ago, much like Saya de Malha Bank, both the Sunda and Sahul shelves here were dry land, only to flood as global temperatures started to rise again, creating the largest expanse of shallow water anywhere on the planet. The similar histories of these shelves and the Saya de Malha Bank might also help explain why this region appears to be the biggest hotspot for seagrass, as much of these sea floors remain covered in loose sediments left over from drier days. Of course, wherever there are exposed rocks breaking through the soil, huge coral reefs are supported, such as the Apo Reef in the Philippines, the New Caledonian reefs, and of course, greatest of them all, the Great Barrier Reef off Australia. Beyond these shelves, however, are a collection of volcanic seamounts and plateaus, helping to support even more coral reefs deep into the Pacific. All in all, this technically forms one continuous coral kingdom from the southern tip of Africa all the way to Polynesia, though here it's been divided into three realms: the West, the Central, and the East Indo-Pacific. Now, I'm not really sure why the World Wildlife Foundation chose to split things up like this, as this paper doesn't really go into the specifics like that, but I trust they have their reasons. Beyond the Great Indo-Pacific, the southern half of Australia dips back below the Tropic of Capricorn, where waters cool back down and kelp once again takes over, forming the temperate Australasian realm. And beyond this, there's, Antarctica. And I know I forget Antarctica a lot, but in terms of marine environments, it might actually be the most memorable. That's because so far we've seen how the ocean is one long series of interconnected ecosystems, but Antarctica is actually the sole landmass that shares none of its continental shelf. This has left its coasts as their own entirely isolated ring within the greater oceanic ring, meaning of all the world's oceans, the Southern Ocean might actually be the most distinct, both geographically and as a result, biologically, as over half the species found here are endemic, living nowhere else on Earth. Similar to the Arctic though, its position surrounding the South Pole gives these waters a high seasonality, where the sun sets for half the year and ice extends across nearly the entire shelf, scouring any rocky surfaces of life, leaving most of the Antarctic shelf without large photosynthesizers, again putting the burden of primary production entirely on plankton, creating the Southern Ocean realm. And with that, we've made it from the top of the world to the bottom and have seen everything in between. I mean, trust me, there's plenty more to talk about, but if this video really is used in some marine biogeography lecture or whatever, then class is almost over, so let me wrap this up. Ultimately, what I learned from this is that terrestrial and marine environments play by two entirely different sets of rules. On land, everything has access to the sun, so life is built around finding water and food, whereas in the ocean, light is a rare commodity, while water is a non-issue and food will come to you if you're patient enough. And this difference is what has led to the formation of several different ecological structures, based almost entirely on their geography. And that's why I so desperately wanted something like this for my marine bio class, as now I feel like I understand the ocean to a degree that I didn't before, and I hope now you do too. If you'd like to continue learning about some deep, dark places with me, you should seriously check out my latest AstroPro video, where I explore the many possible worlds that remain to be found at the outskirts of the solar system. While this video won't be on YouTube for another few days, you can watch it right now on Nebula, the streaming service built by all your favorite YouTubers, including me. Best of all, you can get access to this content and more for less than $15 a year when you sign up for Nebula through the sponsor of today's video, CuriosityStream. This way you'll be paying less while also getting access to a huge library of high-quality documentaries. So even though I didn't get to talk much about the deep ocean in this video, here on CuriosityStream, David Attenborough himself will take you through the process of researching, exploring, and making discoveries at the bottom of the sea in the show called Deep Ocean. How fitting. So to recap, all you need to do to get access to Nebula, where you can watch videos from people like that AstroPro guy early, and CuriosityStream, where there are thousands more documentaries to choose from, is check out the link in the description, which will bring you right where you need to go to take advantage of this deal. As always, thank you all for watching until the very end. I know I haven't been very active this past month or so, but now that I'm fully moved into my house, this is going to change, and I have a lot of great videos planned for this year, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on what's coming. I'd also like to thank all my patrons for their patience and continued support, especially as I was moving into my new place and couldn't work as usual. They all make what I do possible, so if you like what I do here and would like to continue seeing videos like this, there's a link on screen that'll take you over to my Patreon. Other than that, like the video and I'll see you very soon with another one. Thanks.